Welcome to 1 Corinthians. Let me give you a little bit of background as we delve into this book. 1 Corinthians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to Christians in Corinth, and it's a pretty interesting letter for us because it's the longest sort of conversation that Paul has with a church about the issues of being church, about the issues of being Christians together. And so Corinth has some pretty unique things, but can be translated to a lot of different places. Corinth was the leading city in its region. It was right on the trade routes, so it was an economic boom town. People came there to make their fortunes. Not a lot of people were from there, but they came there to do what they had to do to get ahead. It also was a leading city in terms of religion. Historians believe that about 12 temples were around at the time of Paul. The biggest and most influential was that of the Temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And that temple had surrounding it a practice of temple prostitution. And so as part of the religion, it was a lot of sexual immorality. So the city of Corinth has a huge problem with sexual immorality, and Paul's going to deal with that and talk about that throughout the letter. We know from Acts chapter 18 that Paul was in Corinth for a year and a half, helping to plant that church and get that church started, and then he moved on to other places. As we get started in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul begins sort of setting the tone right away in chapter 1. In verses 8 and 9 of chapter 1, he says these words, he, that's Jesus, he will keep you strong to the end so that you will be blameless on the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. God, who has called you into fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, is faithful. And so what Paul is doing is he's setting the faithfulness of God opposite the unfaithfulness of this church. And he's talking about this unfaithfulness not as behavior to be corrected, though it is. He's actually talking about it how it actually doesn't reflect the nature of God, the one who has called you, the one who is keeping you. And so he uses the perfection and faithfulness of God to highlight what's going on in Corinth, but he also uses it as to power. It's because God is faithful, even when we're unfaithful, that we're able to get out of the behaviors and the problems that we have. So he goes right into that in chapter 1. He spends some time identifying some of the problems that we'll look at. One of those is divisions. There are divisions within the church. Some say they follow Paul, some say they follow a guy by the name of Apollos, and they have these divisions. And so that has led to problems and schism and disunity in the church. And so Paul begins to deal with that. He also deals with what seems to be an underlying self-importance. You're going to read a lot about how Paul says, remember what you were when you were called. Remember how God took nothing and made it into something. Remember all these things. You are not wise. You are not as great as you think. He's going to talk about the wisdom of God, or the foolishness of God, and the wisdom of men. And it seems that they took great comfort in their knowledge and their wisdom. And Paul is kind of poking holes in that, to let them know that it's not because they're wise that they're loved. They're loved, which is what can make them wise. And then the third one is the sexual immorality. And he's going to talk about specific instances in the book, but he talks about this immorality not so much even as a bad behavior, which it is, but he talks about it more as a poor reflection on who Jesus is. That we've been called out of that. We don't need to be living that way. And so he's going to deal with those things. And then in chapter 4, verse 7 is another very sort of important verse for them to understand who they are, how they fit, not to look down on other people. And he says this, for what makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? And so he's talking about the divisions, he's talking about this superiority, he's talking about Christians looking down on other people. And he's saying, look, you're no different than anybody else. You have received a gift. And if you have received a gift, there's no room to boast. So we're going to read through chapter 5, verses chapter 1 through 5 this week. And we'll do five chapters a week. Enjoy the book of 1 Corinthians.